Well, hello, my name is Nathan Winters. I am the president of the Wyoming Family Alliance, and we have with us in the studio today Senator Brian Boner. Senator Boner has been a stalwart defender of life and someone who articulates truth in a very thoughtful, reasonable way. And so let me just say, Brian, it's so good to have you with us in here today. And I want people to get to know you a little better. And what I know thus far is you grew up here in the state of Wyoming. Can you give us a little bit of your background?
Yeah, sure. I appreciate you having me, Nathan, and thanks for this opportunity. I appreciate working with you first in the legislature and now this vital work that you're doing through Wyoming Family Alliance. And so, keep up the good work. And like I said, excited for today's conversation. But so as you mentioned, I was born and raised in Wyoming, born in Casper. We kind of moved around a lot, Converse County, growing up, but finally settled on a farm just by Orange Junction when I was about 10 years old. And that's where I grew up the most, I guess you could say. And so graduated from Douglas High School, went to the University of Wyoming, 2 degrees there, one in political science. The other one was in Russian. And, the sheep don't respond to me any better when I yell at them in Russian. But
are you reading Russian poetry or Dostoevsky or War and Peace? That'll put anybody to sleep.
Right. Yeah.
What were you doing there?
It's kind of mutually assured destruction. Sheep are supposed to put you to sleep, right? If you count them too much, and then
mutually assured destruction. Way to use that Russian right there.
But yeah, probably not quite as artful if I'm yelling at them.
Right.
But won't repeat any of the words here. But it actually ended up being really useful because the first job I had right out of college was in the active duty Air Force. So like many folks my age, I was, came of age right after 9/11 and felt the need to serve my country. And I thought, it'd be great to be an Air Force pilot and I want to fly planes and see the world. And so I was a part of the Air Force ROTC program at the university and ended up actually going into the missile field. So it ended up in a hole in the ground and not flying, and definitely stayed here in Wyoming at Warren Air Force Base for most of it instead of seeing the world. But it was a tremendous experience to operate the strategic nuclear arsenal. That's not experienced too many folks in their mid-20s have an opportunity to handle, and taught me how to handle a lot of responsibility there. So, and kind of lift my skills as to the way the world works a little bit. And it was right after I started pulling alerts, the Russians invaded Georgia in 2008. And so it began my operational experience in our nuclear deterrence force, was this sudden realization that, here's this country, the other major nuclear power in the world, that isn't nearly as friendly to the United States and our friends as we thought they were. So learned a lot and made lots of great friends, great experience. But after about 6 years of that, thought, that was plenty at that point. The way it worked back then in the missile field, you're basically done doing the operational stuff. You're going to be doing staff work or, and maybe not really doing much of the actual work. And that's about that time I decided I was going to go back to the ranch, and where I work to this day. We got cattle and sheep we raise up there, and also deal with the tremendous amount of energy activity up there north of Douglas in particular.
That's quite a background. So when you think of it, knowing the ag side of things and coming off of a ranch, going back to a ranch, but also international relations, thinking of international issues through a very specific point of view, I think that's very helpful. And even the background in Russian. So I think it's wonderful to have all of that experience focused at helping the state of Wyoming. What caused you to get involved in the legislature or in politics?
Right. I've always been interested in the legislature, even when I was in high school.
Political science major.
Right, exactly. So, there's that. And really what piqued my interest was the individual, the senator who I ended up replacing, Jim Anderson from Glen Rock. He was a teacher forever. He taught my parents when they were going through the Glen Rock school system, and he always had that teacher's heart. And part of that was kind of working with us high school kids at the time, and he'd give us research projects to do. And that's really what, I was browsing that LSO website back even, when I was still in high school, and trying to do my best to make sense of bills and provide little summaries for them. And so that really piqued my interest more than anything. And then so, fast forward almost 15 years later, he ends up moving to Wisconsin, and I end up applying to fill the spot there. And so,
what year was that?
That was 2015.
I remember that my first term in the legislature was basically his last.
Right.
And I do remember the strong respect many people had. How many years did he serve?
between 15 and 20. He was in the House in the late 90s and ended up going all the way through the Senate, was Senate president, and then ran one more term and didn't quite finish that term. That's when I stepped in.
So that was 2015.
Right.
Now you're coming around to being able to take all of the experiences you've been able to build up to that point and begin to apply them in the legislature. And what I recall from the beginning is you have been really wonderful in articulating the truths that surround the right that every person has to life, whether they're in the womb or out of the womb. And so what really sharpened you up, because you articulate those things so well, but what is the background that helped you become such a good defender of the right to life?
It's something, once again, it's been an important part of my life since I was relatively young. I remember going to the Right to Life marches, even as a child. It's something that even my grandmother was involved in at the statewide organization. I believe she was the secretary for many years, and that was going back to the 70s. And so lucky to have that example in my life. And it's really neat to kind of see that hopefully come full circle where we're building off their work, we're doing great work, even immediately after Roe versus Wade was decided, saying that, no, we're not going to let this stand. And here 50 years later, we have an opportunity to, not just with the Dobbs decision, but now at the state level, once again, we have an opportunity to make decisions that make sense for the people of Wyoming and reflect our values. So it's a tremendous honor to have an opportunity to be a part of that discussion. I feel in some ways I'm like kind of carrying on that family legacy too.
That's wonderful, because when we consider what it means to be conservative, we believe in something called transcendent truth, something that is not just relevant in one generation, but is relevant from generation to generation because it's eternal truth. And so when you consider the almost 50 years between Roe versus Wade versus the Dobbs decision just recently, almost a half a century elapsed in that time frame. And you're right, there are many people that carried forward, or as I like to say, they were forging their link in the chain of history. They could only forge their own link, but we then have to forge ours as well. And so link up with them and then link ourselves to the future. And so I really appreciate that kind of conservative thinking. Often what I have found about conservatives is they have a strong base in an understanding of philosophy that's rooted in eternal truth. How did you come to recognize that? I mean, offline, you and I have talked a little bit about an understanding of philosophy that goes back to the early modern Enlightenment and forward. You mentioned Locke and others, and for me, I love the folks that came right after him in the Scottish Enlightenment. Where did you begin digging into those kind of truths?
I'm thankful to have that background. I mean, first of all, my undergrad, political science, I probably didn't quite pay attention to my philosophy class as much as I should have, but I was more concerned with the classes that really interested me were like the practical nature of doing, getting legislation across the line, what it looks like, how a congressman interacts with his constituents, so on and so forth. But more recently, and coming to the realization that we're in a unique moment, or not necessarily unique, but something that happens every 50 to 60 years, where, last time we were in a time of transition politically, and last time that happened was the 1960s, and you can go back before then to the early 1900s, a lot of turmoil back then as well. We have one of the portraits in the Wyoming House of Representatives has a tear in it from that time, when, you had the Bull Moose Party, you had President McKinley being assassinated, and you see a lot of that happening again in the 60s and now today. And so it really forced me to kind of go back to the basis I had in my academic education, say, okay, this is a once every couple generations moment that we're in. And we're seeing that a little bit with some of the Supreme Court decisions that really empower the states and empower legislative branches of government. And we have an opportunity to chart a good course for the state of Wyoming. I think that absolutely has to acknowledge our history and our understanding that ultimately our government is not meant to necessarily dictate morality, but it's predicated upon the assumption that there are other elements within our society, whether it be our churches or community organizations, even the Rotary Club, the Lions Club, wherever they may be, that do promote a certain amount of social cohesion and a sense of morality. So the government doesn't have to, and it's worked really well for a while. And now I think that you just understand the importance of that, recognizing the limits of what the government can and can't do, and that's become more obvious to me the more experience I gain in the legislature, and also recognizing the moment that we're in right now. So
I really appreciate that, because when you think of it, everyone makes a decision based on some moral philosophy or ethic. And so the question is, what kind of ethic might that be? And so when we talk about morality, amorality, immorality, whatever it is, you can't escape the understanding that you are going to be using a framework, a worldview, as it were, for how you come to your decisions. And so what I just heard in that conversation is an understanding of history, which is so very helpful, and I think important too, because often you'll find people who seem to be disengaged from history. And as a result, instead of taking big ideas and weighing them against a wealth of information from the past, what I appreciate about that is that, I think it was around 900 years ago, and I forget the guy's first name, but I know he's from Canterbury. But he talked about how, William of Canterbury, I think, but he talked about how basically what we know and what we see is not because we see further than others because we are smarter than they are, or because our eyesight is better than they are. We see further than they do because we're sitting on their shoulders as though we're sitting on the shoulders of giants. And as a result, when you look at your love of history, the apparent love of history, and the desire to think through things in a very thoughtful way, I'm appreciative of that, because I know that Wyoming benefits, and I love this state. And so to watch someone who is thinking through the things carefully is very, very good. So what we've done is we've come all the way up to 2015 and your interest into the legislature, and then even looking at some of the legislation that you have brought on the subject of life. What are some of the major issues that you also have been working on over the years?
yeah, obviously those are really important ones. School choice is important, and these represent areas, as I mentioned earlier, where we were constrained, either by U.S. Supreme Court precedents or even some unfortunate parts of our own state constitution, which were born of a pretty unsavory past, I'll say, a bigotry against particular religious groups. As a practicing Catholic, maybe I'm a little bit more sensitive to that than others. But overall, with the ability to pursue school choice without discriminating against folks with a religious mindset, the ability to now, at very least, regulate abortion, hopefully have the ability to curtail or outlaw it with some exceptions. These are all opportunities that we haven't even when I first started. And so, those are huge issues. And just overall, I think that as more from a fiscal policy standpoint, we've been very fortunate to have a significant revenue source in our oil and gas, our coal industries, our extractive industries. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think it's possible that we take that good thing and do it so much that it becomes a negative. And so a lot of our fiscal policies are focused around the redistribution of wealth, which could be appropriate to a certain extent. But when we start getting too much into the business of, say, what should be the decision-making authority of a school board or a local county commission or a local city government, and we start coming up with too many formulas to how to redistribute all this wealth, we begin to sort of eviscerate their own authority, their own responsibility. It's something that should be really left to the local level. I think we have an opportunity now to finally begin to make some changes there, to say empower your local school board instead of having like a little discussion they're having in Cheyenne right now, from what I read, where there's no flexibility how you improve your school facilities. It's driven completely by the state. That's because the state's paying for 100% of it. There's no responsibility for anybody at the local level to raise, even a temporary tax, for example, to replace our schools. So I don't think we do our school boards any favors when we do that. I don't think we do our counties any favors when they're too dependent upon us, instead of making it maybe a tough decision. What's the right amount of sales tax to have in our county? It's a lot easier just to come to Cheyenne and say, let's, give us more.
I know we used to have bond measures. So how does that factor in?
I advocate for returning that for school capital construction, where if you need to replace your school, it happens, right? It's a legitimate function of government, but you can't have a Taj Mahal. You're going to have to justify it to the voters, and they're going to have skin in the game. And if, the state still has to play an equalizing role to a lesser extent than we do now, I understand that, we should maybe not just leave folks in, say, Niobrara County out to dry totally, but there needs to be more responsibility at the local level for, say, school capital construction. And because the dynamic we have now, especially with our government K-12 schools, is that all the authority for spending, at least, lies with the school board, but none of the responsibility, none whatsoever. It's 100% dictated by the legislature. And so I'm sure it sounds good in the courtroom, but I could have told you as a 25-year-old lieutenant that you need to have some parity between those two factors, responsibility and authority. So,
boy, very intriguing. So I appreciate the thoughtfulness that you're working through those big issues. So now you've been in the legislature, it sounds like around 9 years, so almost a decade. And then so the question for us, I suppose, is what are some of your goals and dreams and ideas on how you would like to continue working, but working now with quite a bit of experience. So what's in the future for Senator Brian Boner?
Well, I'm focused on law, the work that we got across the finish line, at least legislatively. Unfortunately, there's a pretty heavy influence with the governor vetoing lots of the important bills that we were able to pass. And so, first priority is finishing that work, whether it be enhancing school choice, protecting innocent life, enhancing our Second Amendment rights. We do a pretty good job in the state of the Second Amendment rights, but there's always room to move forward, especially say with gun-free zones. We're actually more restrictive than Colorado, if you believe it or not.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it's there's progress that could be made there, and also looking at the kind of the bread and butter of what the legislature does, how we appropriate funds, how we, what level of control do we have over local entities' budget, and would we be better off just allowing them more decision-making authority and let them justify that directly to our constituents. And I think that's a much better way, much more direct way of administering local government. So there's lots of work to do. That's years worth of work as far as I'm concerned, especially with some of the challenges we have in our K-12 system with the court cases. But overall, I think in terms of the Senate, I think I'm thankful that the chamber is relatively stable. That's the function the Senate performs, right? It's supposed to be the more long-term thinking, 4-year terms instead of 2-year terms, so you're not constantly campaigning. And so looking forward to working with my Senate colleagues and improving the level of debate. I think, once again, we're in this transitionatory time frame where a lot of the old norms, which were meant to elevate our debate and to produce the best policy outcomes for the state of Wyoming, have kind of been thrown in the trash, right? And so we have to focus on developing new traditions. It used to be that you didn't really get involved in other senators' primaries. We see that being rampant now this past primary. And so we have to reestablish those norms. And if nothing else, we need to focus on when you step on that Senate floor in the Senate chamber, you need to leave all that behind, all the campaign behind, all the things that happen in the primary or the general election behind, and just focus on what's best for the state of Wyoming. And so that's my priority. I'm going to be running for majority floor leader in the Senate. And so that's, for those reasons, I think I can, make sure that we move the ball forward in the way that our constituents want to see, but also do so in a way that respects our traditions and acknowledging that there's some work that we have to do to improve the civility of the legislature.
So I know how the majority floor leader works on the House side of things. And by the way, as you talk about civility in the course of debate in the Senate, I remember, obviously I didn't get to watch a lot of Senate debate because I was in the House debating. And I remember it being very fast-paced and lots of different things getting thrown around as far as ideas on the House floor. And then I went over and I had the chance to visit the Senate for the first time after I got out of the House. And I remember thinking, there's a lot more philosophy flowing here. There's a slightly different pace. And I thought, this is really wonderful. But what you're saying is that's changing a little bit. And so I appreciate, though, the way you're talking about the need to, when the election is over, to move out of campaign mode and into governing mode. And it makes a lot of sense to make sure that we are getting good legislation and making sure that our arguments are sound. And so I appreciate that. So you're running for majority floor leader. Would you explain to everyone, what does the majority floor leader do and why is that important?
You are representing the majority party, right? So it's a partisan position. The minority party has their partisan positions, and that's distinct from, say, the president or the vice president, which is elected by everybody. But overall, you're primarily responsible for prioritizing the bills that come to the floor. So a bill gets introduced, it goes to a committee. If it makes it out of committee, you hear it on the floor, and that's where the whole Senate has a chance to discuss the bill at hand, and the floor leader is responsible for managing all that. And so I hope that that's one way we can improve stability, just having that laser focus on the policy and giving senators the chance to make sure they, first of all, understand what the bills are going to be the next day or two, so they have a chance to study what it is, and it's not necessarily a surprise. So being as intentional as we can about that process and recognizing there's no such thing as the element of surprise in the legislative process. It's all very public, and so that's really important to elevate our debate. And that's why I hope to bring that, especially that experience as an airman in the Air Force, being as methodical and planning as much ahead as we can, making sure folks have a chance to really think about the implications of the policy that we'll be discussing.
Well, that sounds really good. I really appreciate then your willingness to come and talk to us and kind of share not only with us, but with people across the state of Wyoming what your story is, what your background is, and all of the different ways in which your life has shaped you to be a leader for this moment and a leader for the state of Wyoming. And I'm very thankful for all that has happened that has led you to this moment. So thank you so much for being with us here at Wyoming Family Alliance and stopping by the studio.
So, well, appreciate the opportunity once again, Nathan. Keep up the good work.
Thank you very much.